This interview took place in Tulsa, Oklahoma. This interview is being re-recorded on March the 14th, 1985 for inclusion in the permanent collections of the Oral History Program by Judith Michener.
This is Penn Woods recording for the Oklahoma Living Legends. The day is March 1st, 1971. I'm in Tulsa, Oklahoma in the Petroleum Club building in the office of Mr. DJ Pete Tuepker. Mr. Tuepker is retired as the president and chairman of the board of Public Service Company of Oklahoma. He's a longtime member of that company, and today he serves as a consultant for that company, but also he tells us that he is more involved in free work. He has been on a number of commissions, both for the city of Tulsa and for the state of Oklahoma. Mr. Tuepker, to open up, I'd like for you to give me a little of your personal background, beginning with who your parents were, where they were born and what their names were, then where you were born and when you came to Oklahoma.
Fine, Penn. My father was Fred Tuepker, and he was a clothing merchant. And my mother's name was Alma Holke, H-O-L-K-E. They were both born in Missouri. I was born in Blackburn, Missouri, which is a little town 65 miles from Kansas City on the old main line of the Chicago-Alton Railway. We came to Oklahoma in 1910 and lived at Okmulgee, Oklahoma, where my father and my uncle had purchased a clothing store, and he was in business until the late 20s. Both my parents are now dead.
In Okmulgee, why don't you tell us about the earliest remembrances that you have at Okmulgee and describe the town as you remember it at that time?
Well, Okmulgee had just finished the Parkinson Hotel, and it was quite a sight out on the prairie town, 5 stories high, and to a small boy who'd made the trip from the Frisco Depot in a transfer limousine, 4 horses, and down a brick street, the only paved street in the town, to the hotel. Of course, I'd heard a lot about Indians, and most our family in Missouri kissed us goodbye. They thought we'd be scalped soon anyway after we arrived in Oklahoma. Okmulgee has always been a very fine place to me. I lived through the days, of course, when Oklahoma had a lot of its people in Okmulgee because it was an oil center, and the flesh production abounded around Okmulgee, and at one time had a population of 34,000 people. I went to school in Okmulgee and graduated from Okmulgee High School. Okmulgee is a beautiful little town, and now is quite a great deal smaller than it was in the boom days of the oil rush. The old creek capital that remains there has always been of interest to me. They still were responsible for the full investment dollar, and they were still responsible for paying about 1/4 of their income out in taxes, federal, state, and local, while the REAs will average about 3 cents out of $1 for taxes.
In the public service company, you mentioned 2 people. Can you think of any others, thinking particularly back in the growth of the company, who played a major role, whose names ought to be mentioned?
Well, I always think about the great contribution that Joe McCrary made in the early days from an engineering standpoint. I also think of the contribution that Logan Grigsby made, who was an excellent electrical engineer in the planning of the public service system. These were two outstanding men in the history of the company.
Thinking in terms of the rural development of public service company, its expansion into the rural area and over the years, could you discuss that any?
Yes, I could. In fact, as a rural electrical program really got underway, I was manager at Veneta, which is an agricultural area. At the time that I became manager, we had 141 so-called rural customers. When I left 8 years later, we had over 2,500. Now, the interesting thing that people, I don't think, realize generally, that when we first went out to sell the farmer on electricity, he didn't buy easily. He said, well, I don't need light. I've got a good lantern. I can see. But we tried to tell him that the lady of the house needed running water. Well, he said, I can take care of that. I'll pump her a couple of buckets full in the morning and a couple of buckets full of the night. And it was difficult to sell the farmer that electricity, and you know what really sold the farmer on electricity? It was a man whose son came back from service, or his daughter who came back from working in the city, and the old crystal set was not good enough, and they said, we're not coming back unless you get electricity and get modern. And people that I've talked to 4 and 5 years before suddenly came in and said, when can you build me an electric line to my place?
What about your work with 4-H and FFA and with other farm groups?
All our managers, particularly in the rural part of our company, and after all, outside of a few towns, most of the area we serve are small towns, and more or less we're kind of an REA in our service territory, because we do serve a lot of rural small towns. Tulsa, Lawton, Bartlesville, McAllister, Okmulgee, Chickasha, Elk City, Clinton. I think I mentioned Lawton. Those are the large towns that we serve, but we serve 239 small towns, and their population is not very great.
Why don't you tell me a little about your own family, your own immediate family?
I have no children. I was married. My first wife died in 1965, and I'm now remarried.
What do you foresee for Tulsa's future, particularly in view of the court that's coming here and such? What do you feel is going to be the future of Tulsa?
Tulsa has an unlimited future. The waterway will have considerably to do with it. However, the growth will not be rapid because of water transportation. It will take some 10 years, in my opinion, for the port to fully develop its real impact on this community. However, I think that a lot of satellite industries will move into the Tulsa area because of the excellent transportation. And even though they don't use water, water compelled freight rates are a great incentive to them.
What do you feel is going to be the future of the smaller towns?
Well, the smaller towns of Oklahoma need an industrial program of their own. There are many industries that can operate in the small towns of Oklahoma with transportation such as it is now. We've talked with a lot of industries that would like to have, for instance, an assembly plant in Tulsa. One part of their operation in a town 50 miles away, another part of it someplace else, and move the finished parts into Tulsa for assembly and shipment. I think the small town with enough ingenuity and enough hard work has a great future.
What are you all doing to promote these small towns?
We're working with their organized Chamber of Commerce. We regularly make trips to all our towns, keep in constant touch. If we have any industrial leads, we take those to our smaller towns just as well as our larger towns.
This has been an interview with Mr. D.J. Tuepker, retired president and chairman of the board of the...
What do you foresee for Tulsa's future, particularly in view of the port that